Hello and welcome. 2 Corinthians 2 verse 14, it says, "Now thanks be to God who always leads us in triumph in Christ, and through us diffuses the fragrance of his knowledge in every place." Paul had spent 18 months to start and strengthen the church at Corinth. Upon his leaving, one sin after another took up residence in that communion of believers. Conditions in Corinth church had become so bad that Apollos would not stay or return to Corinth, though Paul urged him to do that. Additionally, false teachers had come into the Corinthian church and managed to deceive members of the church to join an open mutiny against Paul. Paul's character was being blasted. His name was being slandered. On top of that, in Ephesus, where he was, a riot had started that could have taken his life. He was on the brink of death every day. Paul was discouraged, so much so that when the door was opened in Troas to preach the gospel, in verse 13, it says, he was restless. He had lost his zeal for the work. He had lost heart. Everything seemed to be going wrong. So, how was he going to deal with his discouragement? In verse 14, he steps out of this despair and depression and says, "But thanks be to God." What? What happened in the white space between verse 13 and 14 in the midst of despair, discouragement, depression? He is catapulted to a completely different level. And he begins to realize the privilege of being a part of the conquering army of the triumphant. And it changes everything in his perspective. That's what makes him say, "Thanks be to God." That background is triggered by the word in verse 14, triumph. That word triumph is a technical term, and it had some very significant meaning in the Roman world. It was the highest honor that could ever be paid to a victorious Roman general. When the Roman government gave a general a triumph, that was the ultimate. To be granted a triumph, the Roman general must have been the actual commander-in-chief in the field. The campaign that he engaged in must have been completely finished. The region which was conquered, completely pacified. A positive extension of Roman territory must have been gained and the victorious troops brought home. In the triumph, the procession of the victorious general marched through the city of Rome all the way to the capital. First, there came the state officials and the Senate. Then followed the trumpeters who were heralding what was coming. Then came the spoils taken from the conquered land. Then there came some painted pictures of the conquered land. Then they are followed by the white bull, which was going to be offered as a sacrifice to the gods. Then there came the wretched captives, the enemy princesses, leaders, and generals in chains, shortly to be flung into prison and in all probability to be executed. Then there came the lictors or punishers who were beating these people with rods. And then there came the musicians. Following them came the priests swinging their censers with the sweet-smelling incense burning. And then came the general himself after all of this huge entourage. He was in a chariot drawn by 4 horses. He was clad in a purple tunic embroidered with gold and palm leaves, and over it a purple toga marked out with golden stars, and after him rode his family. And finally, at the very end, came the army wearing all their decorations and shouting, "Triumph! Triumph! Triumph!" And along the edge of the road, of course, are mobs of people cheering. It was a tremendous day, a day which probably happened once in a lifetime. That is the picture in Paul's mind when he says, "Thanks be to God, who always leads us in his triumph in Christ. No matter what may be going wrong in your life, no matter how disappointing, discouraging, depressing, how difficult it might be, we are following the conquering hero in the victory parade, not as a captive, not as a prisoner headed to judgment, but as co-conqueror. As a born-again Christian, you are privileged to be marching among the ranks of those who serve the sovereign Lord. Christ is the universal conqueror marching in triumph down through the corridors of time throughout the conquered world. He is in the lead, and we, his chosen warriors, march behind him. You see, we don't have to win all the little fights. We don't have to win all the little struggles along the way. It should be enough for us to belong to the troops of the commander of all commanders, to have been chosen by God to be a soldier of Jesus Christ, to wear his uniform, to carry his weapon, the word, to bear his name, to serve his cause. That should be enough. Just the contemplation of the privilege of being associated with Jesus Christ should bring back the joy. Thanks God that I will triumph because Christ always triumphs. Please follow me on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and let's get connected.